So it's been a while. I mean, we had Jeff on last week, but you're finally back.
I'm not feeling spurned.
I know. We had too much to talk about. I didn't have time for you.
Jilted lover thing. Really hurt.
It happens, but at least he didn't win the NCAA bracket. He was second to last, only ahead of me. So I think we can all breathe a sigh of relief on that one.
Yeah, I'd say we did well.
It was the least surprising tournament I've ever watched.
I guess it's probably true. Yeah. In many ways.
All right. Well, now we're on to golf and baseball season. That's all I have to say. Baseball season will be ending for me soon.
The Red Sox are already out of the pennant race. So
I know. I mean, exactly.
Okay.
All right. Let's do this. Shall I do the introduction?
Do it. Go.
On this episode of the AAF Exchange, tax claims, misstatements, and confusion, and a regulatory win? Joining us to discuss all of this is Douglas Holtz-Eakin, and making his return to the podcast later on is AAF's Director of Regulatory Policy, Dan Goldbeck. But first up is, of course, Doug. Doug, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Tell us what's been on your mind recently.
FAFSA. I wrote the morning email about the free application for federal student aid, FAFSA. I don't know if you were here when Lamar Alexander gave a presentation at AAF, and he did his famous hold up the FAFSA application, which is 10 pages long, drapes all over the floor, says, this has got to be simpler, we can do this. And 2021, they passed the legislation, said simplify it. It's now 2024, and it doesn't work. It's a disaster. And I knew that there were problems, like there were incorrect. There were 200,000 that were done incorrectly, and they didn't do the inflation adjustment. They had to go back and do it, so it was late. What I didn't realize is that as a result, applications are 27% below what they were last year.
Wow.
Which means there are really a lot of young people who will not apply, not get aid, and not go to college who otherwise would have. That's a disaster.
So it made the problem worse.
It's a disaster, yes.
Yeah.
You want to simplify it so more people can go to college, and in the process, you have fewer people go.
Yeah. As somebody who used this program back when they were going to school, I couldn't think it could get much harder to do, but apparently...
I know. Disaster. Unbelievable.
Well, so I know in the future we're going to have a long conversation about higher education in general, based off of some actions of the administration. One of their big things is student loans. So we'll wait to talk about all that then.
We will do that.
You'll have to tune in later to hear all of that. But let's turn to some of these tax claims, misstatements, and the general confusion around tax policy, and start with the president's claim in the State of the Union address that there are, and I'm quoting this one, 1,000 billionaires now, and you know what their average tax rate is? 8%. That was the president in the State of the Union address. Doug, how did the president come up with this?
So how do you calculate the average tax rate? Well, you take taxes paid and divide it by income. Now, it would seem that the appropriate denominator would be taxable income, and so you'd have taxes as a fraction of taxable income, but that's not what that is. Mm-hmm. If you put taxes and divide it by some measure of income plus unrealized capital gains, which is essentially a wealth measure, you can get to 8%. But that's mixing apples and oranges. We don't have a tax system that taxes unrealized capital gains, so it doesn't make any sense to do that calculations. It's just really misleading.
Mm-hmm. But is that whole thing just a prelude into them designing this wealth tax that they've been talking about?
Well, certainly they're aiming there, right? They proposed taxing unrealized capital gains a while back in the president's budget. They may come out with it again. It's never gotten any real traction on Capitol Hill. There's a real question about its constitutionality. Can we actually have a tax on wealth / unrealized capital gains? There's a case right now before the Supreme Court that's going to essentially address this issue, at least in part. Mm-hmm. It goes back to the 2017 Act. There was a piece of that act that said, we're going to tax corporations based on the profits they have overseas, and we're going to deem them as having been brought back. So we're going to pretend they're back, and upon repatriation, they get taxed. Well, people didn't actually do that. So this couple sued saying, look, we never realized our income. We never brought it back. It's still sitting over in India.
Right.
You can't tax us. And they might have a case. So we'll see.
Interesting. We'll have to pay attention to that.
Yes.
I'm sure you'll do one of your great reaction videos on that as
So
well.
we'll find out in June, and in July, my hair will be on fire.
Yeah.
So, hey.
Yeah, I love that.
Oh, wait, I don't have any
these
hair.
Supreme Court birthdays come out, or cases come out around my birthday, June 30th, and then of course July 4th is so it's like, I get all these gifts.
We do this for you, Kyle.
Yeah,
yes.
I know. It's all, as we know, the calendar revolves around me. But anyways, so I mean, but this is their plan this is how they always come up with the argument. This is how they're going to balance the budget, right? Like this is, I mean, but you've also written
they're not going to balance the budget.
But you've also written your dish that math just doesn't work out.
Yeah, no, there's a fundamental difference between raising taxes and getting the long-run fiscal situation under control.
Yeah.
And the problem is that the two biggest programs, Social Security and Medicare, which are, if you look at the budget over the next 10 years, Social Security, Medicare, and interest are over 50% of the spending. So you don't touch those. That's it. They're not just big, they're growing faster than any plausible growth in revenues. So revenues are going to grow at roughly the rate of the economy, 2% real plus 2% inflation, 4%. So Security 5.5%, Medicare 7%. So if you raise taxes, you close the gap for a moment, but you don't solve the long run problem. They then just diverge again.
It just keeps going on.
So they love to talk about taxes all the time, but they got to deal with the spending problem.
Right. Let's move on to another interesting claim about U.S. tax policy. In this case, regarding President Biden's record on taxes. A recent New York Times article was headlined, "Biden's promising corporate tax increase has cut taxes overall." I know you lit your hair on fire for this one. Not surprisingly, you wrote your dish on it. Just walk us through.
The key here is the role of tax credits, and in particular refundable tax credits. So if you count against the tax bill all of the clean energy tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, he's a tax cutter. But that's not really what those are. Those are spending programs subsidizing the investment in the production in clean energy. The biggest example would be the enhanced subsidies to the Affordable Care Act exchanges. Those are on the books premium tax credits, and so if you make them bigger, that's a tax cut for everybody in the ACA exchanges. No, come on. So the biggest number in there is the child tax credit. 80% of the child tax credit is just checks being sent to people. They have zero tax liability. They're still eligible for the credit. So he is indeed a big spender. He is not a big tax cutter.
Yeah. So this seems, to me, it sounds like this is just more budget gimmicks at work where they're trying to, use it's an election year, so obviously they're trying to make things seem like this is what he's doing. But
yes, this claim was not even made by the White House.
Yeah.
It was even better. It was made by the New York Times, who ginned up a study from the Tax Policy Center to support this. Everybody involved knows better.
Yeah.
And that's the really irritating
When
part.
I first read your dish, I was like, it's got to be an op-ed that he's talking about in this. But it was an actual article written by the New York Times on this. It's astonishing.
It's disappointing.
Yeah. At least I have through this election season, I'm just going to rely on the dish to fact check all of these different claims and things out there because kind of need it.
It's really remarkable. Like, what is the most common claim made by, this administration or any Democrats, the left in general, about Republicans? Well, it's all that trickle down economics. It's tax cuts for rich people and big corporations. What is the Inflation Reduction Act? Well, it's tax cuts for big corporations and rich people buying EVs.
Yeah,
but it's okay now.
All right, well, let's stay on the subject of taxes. Tomorrow, Friday, the Wall Street Journal will publish an op-ed from former Ways and Means Committee Chairman Kevin Brady and yourself. Just, give us a preview of that.
We're going to hear a lot about the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Most of the provisions sunset at the end of 2025. I think nobody wants that to happen. The president said he doesn't want to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000. I would expect that the same or stronger claims would be made by candidate Trump. So, that's not on the table. So the question is, what will be on the table? And the point of the op-ed is really simple. It's number one, let's not be confused and think that the 2017 bill was just a tax cut. It was actually the first real reform of our tax system since the 86 reform, and it badly needed reform. Cleaned out a lot of special provisions, really improved the fairness of the system, took it out of a lot of economic decisions, which is what you want. You want the tax system to raise revenue without interfering with the economy. So it made a lot of beneficial reforms, but that doesn't mean it was perfect. It doesn't mean the job's done. So the second piece of the op-ed is what we want to do is think about 2025 as not keep the TCJA forever or let it sunset, but what tax reform is the right reform now? Build on what we did in 17. And hopefully that's the way Congress will approach it.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be something we're going to be talking about all year because, the reason why this is coming up now is because it's expiring in the next Congress. So they have to do something with it.
I would like to see people plan.
But also we have an election, so we should be having a conversation about what that plan should be.
I agree.
I mean, it shouldn't just be whatever the campaign rhetoric of the day is. It should be actual talking about some of these longer term issues that we face.
I would love that. It's self-serving because I was on the McCain campaign in 2008, but I feel like every 4 years the conversation's gotten thinner and thinner. There's less real policy discussed on campaigns and more just finger pointing and sort of posturing. And we have real policy issues, and I'd like to hear the candidates talk about that.
Well, I can promise you that on this podcast, at least, we will be talking about the TCJA quite a bit. Hopefully, we can do a little bit deeper of a dive into some of those policy reforms as we continue throughout the year. But I don't want to, fit it into a short amount of time in this podcast.
Looking forward to it. Let's talk taxes.
Yeah, let's do it. But before I let you go, we do have to do the trivia question.
Oh, we do?
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
Jeff was mad last time because I didn't do one for him. And he says, you give Doug these brilliant trivia questions, and I didn't get one.
Well, if Jeff's unhappy, our job is done.
Well, so for today's trivia question, I'm going to test your really short-term memory. 2 economic reports this week. The PPI and the CPI. One came in above expectations, one below expectations. Can you tell me which one was which?
CPI came in hot. PPI came in a little bit soft, not a lot. The top line was
why was that?
I actually haven't had a chance to dig through it. That came out at 8:30 this morning. I was prepping for the trivia questions, so I didn't. No, I just haven't had a chance to look. I'm not the biggest connoisseur of the producer price index. In my experience, it is not a great short-term predictor of outcomes for the CPI or the PCE price index, the thing the Fed looks at. So I focus more on those two, and the PPI wanders along on its own.
One of your interesting takes from the CPI, though, is the Fed rate cuts have gone up in smoke.
It's hard for me to see how you make the case for, especially a June rate cut, when you've got inflation that has really stalled somewhere in the 3% range using the PCE price index. Inflation expectations have stalled somewhere in the 3% range, and the economy's growing quite solidly. So what's the case for a cut? There isn't one.
Yeah, well, we'll have to watch and find out how things unfold throughout the summer, I guess.
Yes. And again, it gets complicated for the Fed the closer that we get to the election. They don't like to move near elections. They're going to do the right thing, but they'd sure rather not have their hand forced.
Yeah, I mean, the president still came out and said, I think the other day, that he still expects them to do at least one rate cut this year. But when is the question? But
I will just point out, that's a real departure, and disappointing for me. I don't think the White House should ever talk about the Fed.
Yeah.
And this administration, to its credit, really hasn't.
Right,
I mean, the Fed has raised rates. It has dramatically fought inflation, and they have stayed out of it by and large. I don't expect Mr. Trump to stay out of it. He's already weighed in a pretty politically charged way. So we'll see how that plays out during the summer as well.
That'll be interesting. Well, Doug, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Dan, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have you back on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a while. I think the last time we were on, we were talking probably regulations, if I were to guess.
Seems to be the case.
But today's topic is pretty significant. The President Biden's regulatory record has definitely been one of an interesting conversation. He recently noted that his administration has already exceeded the entire first-term cost total of regulations during the Obama administration. Walk us through the numbers and how we got here.
So yeah, the Biden administration just passed the $500 billion mark this past week, which exceeds the Obama total for the first term of about $490 billion. The occasion isn't much of a surprise, actually. I thought actually the recent EPA's greenhouse gas rules that were released but not officially published yet would be what pushed them over the edge. Yeah. There was actually this one HHS rule that came in with about $20 billion in costs that pushed it over the edge, and so they've reached that mark now.
Yeah, so I mean, this is Obama's first term, just his first term regulatory costs, and now the Biden administration is just it's quite astonishing.
Yeah, so they've surpassed all that President Obama did in the first term, or his administration did. And so they still have, 8 months left to, depending on how the election, of course, goes.
Right.
We'll see on that, but it's sort of thing of, for the first term, so they have 8 months to go with plenty else to do.
Yeah, so I mean, that first term for Obama, though, that included the Dodd-Frank rules, the ACA rules, and all of those rules as well. So
yeah, so that's one of the things, too, is you saw under Obama, of course, in 2011, 2012 was when you got the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, Dodd-Frank. Obviously, these were bills and laws that Obama himself championed, but they were actual legislative measures, whereas under Biden, you're seeing most of the legislative measures that he champions are on the fiscal side. Mm-hmm. So much of the regulatory side of this is purely administrative policymaking. Really.
Yeah. So the rulemaking that pushed them over the edge, you mentioned it was this that pushed them over the Obama threshold, not the edge, was this rule about the Medicaid program. What was noteworthy about that rule?
So that was actually a pretty interesting rule. Essentially, HHS is looking to streamline Medicaid, CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program. So these couple of programs here, what they're basically doing is making a series of changes to make it easier for folks to either enroll in the programs or if they're already enrolled, to stay enrolled in them. So on one hand, it has all these administrative savings, eliminating a lot of paperwork for individuals and states. But on the other hand, as HHS estimates in it, it'll increase the population of folks on the rolls of these programs. And because of the design of these programs, the states are on the hook for some of the funding that doesn't necessarily get reimbursed by the feds. And so essentially puts about $23 billion on state budgets that they probably weren't expecting to pay for already.
Right. And then you mentioned that you expected it to be some of these environmental EPA rules to push them over the top, but they're not even done yet. So there's some more rules coming down the pipeline.
Sure, yeah. So technically they're done because they're so big and complex and all that. Sometimes it just mechanically takes a while for them to get formally published in the Federal Register, which is what we kind of record for Reg Rodeo. But we expect those, particularly the light-duty vehicles, so the EPA rule involving greenhouse gases coming from just your typical passenger vehicles for the years going forward, that's going to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars, depending upon which discount rate you use. And so that was the one that I thought would really push it over the edge. And of course, whenever it hits, it'll definitely have the total shoot up even more.
Well, that will be an interesting week in regs. So you mentioned your Reg Rodeo, which is a great site. It's regrodeo.org. And then also your weekly email that comes out on Monday, which is weekly Week in Regs, where you do a rundown of all of the previous week's regulations. You track all of the administration stuff. So it's a great resource. So anybody listening should probably go on and sign up or bookmark the Reg Rodeo site.
Absolutely.
So I have one final question for you before you go, though. Are the Giants going to make the playoffs this year?
I hope so. Last night they had a really good effort, and so I hope that continues. They really need their bats to get going, though.
Yeah. Well, my season's over, so I hope you have have a better success than I do. So, Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.